Hello and welcome to Very Little Knitting Tutorials. Today I'm going to show you how to do the purl stitch. In the last couple episodes I showed you how to do a slip knot, how to do a knitted cast on, and how to knit, and now we're going to do the purl stitch, which is the next step in learning skills for knitting. So this is what I did on the previous episode. I knit these stitches and then I turned it and I knit back, and then I knit the next row. And now what I'm going to do is, so this is my right side, but I've knit across that. So now I'm going to turn and I'm going to show you purling on the other side. So when you're purling, it's important to make sure that your yarn is on the front side of your knitting. Because if you slide the yarn over to the back side of your knitting before you start purling, you'll do something that creates two stitches. Do you see that? And what happens is if you knit this as two separate stitches, your knitting is going to start getting larger and larger and larger because you're adding stitches. So it's important to look at your knitting, and your working yarn will be on the right side of your knitting when you first get started. So this is purling Continental style. So we're going to make sure that our yarn is running through our fingers to create tension, which makes sure that the yarn isn't sliding all around everywhere and that your stitches will all be even and uniform. What we're going to do is make sure that the yarn is in the front of the left-hand needle. So I go in the front and under, okay? So because we're doing, so it'll be in the front. So because we're doing a purl stitch, the purl stitch actually begins in the front of the stitch. Make sure that you're not counting that as one stitch. It's this stitch right here. And the first stitch in purling Continental style can be a little bit finicky, and I'll show you how we do it. So take the right hand knitting needle and we put it in front through the hole in the front of the stitch. So you're creating that X that you're used to with the knit stitch, but your knitting needle is now in the front. Your right hand knitting needle is now in the front of the left hand needle. And you're going to take your yarn and you're going to go over your knitting needle, and it creates a loop between the stitches, and you're going to slide that loop through that first stitch. And then, so this is the new stitch and that's the old stitch, and you're going to slide that old stitch off. And what I do after I do the first stitch is I just snug it up a little bit. So again, your yarn is in the front. It needs to remain in the front or else you'll create a yarn over. So sliding your needle into the front of the next stitch, and your yarn goes over top of that needle, and you're going to grab it and slide it through and pull it off. Now the Continental purl stitch, you can actually go fairly quickly with it once you get the hang of it, but it will feel a little bit awkward at first, so be prepared for that. So we're going to go into the front of that stitch and yarn over the top and around. Don't wrap it twice, just once, and then through into the front of the stitch, over, around, and through, into the front of the stitch, over, around, and through, into the front of the stitch, over, around, and through. And what you'll notice is that as you get going on it, your yarn will go automatically where it needs to go for you to grab it. So I'm going under both of those. My yarn is automatically going here. So I'm going under both of those into the stitch. My yarn is exactly where it needs to be. So I just flick my needle up, grab that loop, and pull it through. So I'm going under both, around, and through. Under both, around and through. Don't worry if you're stretching your stitches or they don't look even at this point, because you're just practicing. That's all we're doing. The more you practice, the less pulled out your stitches will be, the more even it will get. That will come with time. So please don't put pressure on yourself to make sure your stitches are perfect. You just need to get practicing. And the more you knit, the better it will look and the more even your stitches will get. And that kind of automatically occurs the more you practice. So we're going to go into the front of that stitch, around and through, into the front of that stitch, around and through, into the front of the stitch, around and through. Also, keep in mind that YouTube has this really great feature that you can go in and you can slow videos right down if you want to. You can pause the video and you can rewind and watch it from certain points over and over again as many times as you need to understand what's happening. And it will slow right down if you need to. So we're going to continue purling this row, going into that stitch, around and through, into that next 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 stitch, around and through, into the next stitch, around and through, and still you're going into the front. Now this last stitch, you want to make sure that you do not drop that stitch, because you want to make sure that you're working it, or else your work will become thinner and thinner on one side. So in through the front of that stitch, around and through. So what you'll notice when you do the purl stitch is that you get these raised bumps on the side that's facing you, which is very cool. And then when you flip your work over, you'll notice that there's these V's that are starting to happen on the other side. So it's the opposite of when you're knitting. When you're knitting, you get the flat side on one side and the bumps on the other. So the flat is on the main side and then the bumps are on the other side. And when you're purling, the bumps are on the main side and the flat is on the opposite side. So we're going to try this again on the next row. So tension your yarn, get it between your fingers, pull the yarn under to the front so that you're not looping it around. Grab your other needle. And again, it looks a little bit tricky. So go into the front of that stitch, bring the yarn around and pop that through the hole. Once that first stitch is done, then the next ones become easier. The first one just looks a little odd when you're first doing it. So then slide your needle into the next stitch, around and slide that through. Your needle into the next stitch, slide that around and through, into the next stitch, slide it around and through, into the next stitch, around and through, into the next stitch, around and through, making sure that X is in the front, around and through, that your right hand needle is creating the X in the front, into the next stitch, around and through, into the next stitch, around and through, into the next stitch, around and through, into the next stitch, around, through, into the next stitch, around and 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 through, and then on your last stitch, into the last stitch, around and through. So that is how you purl Continental style. Please review the video as many times as you need to get the hang of it. If you have any questions, you can post them below. I'm going to continue posting more tutorials, so hopefully there'll be something in there that can help you. I hope you enjoyed this and have a great day.